Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Kelly. And thanks to the Global Center for Journalism Democracy for this really nice invitation and this opportunity to talk about Zika with you guys. Let's start with, first of all, I should also say that it's a pleasure to be in Texas. I was at Fort Hood with the 1st Cavalry Division for 3 years, and then I have family in Dallas and San Antonio and Houston. So I'm really happy to be back in Texas, and to be back here, not for an outbreak or anything, to be back to talk to you guys. It's really good. So let's take a look at this first slide and unpack it a little bit. If you start from the bottom, it says CDC. So if you've been wondering what the best federal agency is, it's CDC. We are a federal agency not headquartered in DC. We're headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. And we are about 16,000 strong, 10,000 full-time employees, about 6,000 contractors, and we're in 70 different countries. And we started in the 1940s. We started working on malaria. When DOD handed off the malaria mission, CDC picked it up, and that began CDC. If you go one line up, you'll see that I am in the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases. And so CDC is divided into centers, institutes, and offices. And each CIO, or Center, Institute, and Office, works on different things. We have a Center for Global Health. We have a Center for Chronic Diseases, Infectious Diseases, Birth Defects, Preparedness and Response. And so my center works on immunization, vaccination, vaccine-preventable diseases, and respiratory diseases. And so I'm an associate director for communication, which sounds very impressive, but essentially I run the communications team for that center. And so I have a group of folks who work on the web, the media relations, all the different campaigns we do for vaccination, and about 34 folks who work for me. But I was, a long time ago, a press officer in infectious diseases, and I had some experience going out to the field, and I still get to go out quite a bit. And my boss is very kind, and she'll let me go out on some of these exercises, or I'm sorry, some of these deployments and responses. So today, we're going to talk about Zika and mosquito-borne viruses, and we're going to talk about communicating when uncertainty is high, which is certainly the case for Zika. And so I noticed in the roster of people coming today that there were a few communicators. And so just to the communicators out there, my hat's off to you, kudos. Communicating is very tough to do, but my kids will tell you that it looks really easy, and they don't understand why it's hard. Communicating is tough. Communicating in an everyday world, there are normally barriers that make it difficult, but communicating in a crisis or response is even harder. And just to give you a little vignette, when CDC sends a team out to, let's say, somewhere in Africa, we'll send people from across CDC, a range of expertises will go out, but we often don't even meet each other until we show up at the site or the country. And so, as you can imagine, the first few days are what we call tough sledding. You're trying to figure out what's going on, you're trying to find resources, logistics are a challenge, but you still have these daily calls with CDC Atlanta. Sometimes we call that the Death Star. And the Death Star, or CDC Atlanta, wants to know why this isn't done yet. Where's the database? How come you haven't done this yet? What is going on? We didn't send you there for fun. And so you're getting this awful, nasty call. And then the team leader will say, after the call, we've got to figure out what's going wrong here. Let's talk about this. What are we doing wrong? Why can't we get going here? And so I'm sitting there, and I spent time in the Army, so I'm not going to raise my hand or volunteer. I'm just going to sit quietly. But in my mind, I'm thinking, well, you know, the lab side of the house, we don't have a rapid diagnostic test, and we're not able to test specimens. So the lab side of the house, that's not going well. And then part of me will say, you know, on the epi side of the house, we can find cases, but we can't find the contacts. And so we're not able to do contact tracing, and that's not going well. And so, but I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to be a good team member. But invariably, somebody will jump up and say, the real problem is communication. We're not communicating effectively. And you're sitting there going, WTF, really, dude? Because we get the lab and the epi, and you're going to complain about the communications? I contend that communications take an unfair, we get beat up a lot. Because people think it's easy and we're easy to blame, but that's not the case. So treat your communicators well, and communicators hang in there. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk today about 6 principles when we've been communicating about Zika. And what's kind of cool, the 6 principles are be prepared, use principles of risk communication. Think marathon, not sprint. You know, be mindful of expectations, account for fears, and address sources of potential confusion. And the backdrop of these 6 is actually the Zika virus taken from an electron microscope. All right, let's go to the next slide. So my first principle really comes from the Boy Scouts. It's be prepared in advance. And when I think of being prepared for a contingency or emergency response or a crisis, I want to know who are the principal decision makers in my organization. Who's going to make the decisions? Then I want to identify the key internal and external audiences and stakeholders. And once I identify these stakeholders and these key audience members, I've got to think about how will I communicate with them? What platforms will I reach them on? And then ideally, I want to get ahead of it with what I call strategic planning or contingency planning, and hopefully some messaging done in advance. And at the CDC, we work under when we activate, when we have something like a Zika or Ebola, it's called the Incident Command System. And I think a lot of you probably know it, ICS. And we will activate, and that means we stand up an emergency operations center under this incident command system. And in that emergency operations system is a joint information center which communicates for us. So we have this ICS system, and we've been activated, gosh, until just recently, we were activated for 4 different contingencies: Ebola, polio, Zika, and Flint, Michigan. So, and I don't remember the last time CDC wasn't activated for something. And so we're a great deal many of us have got ICS experience. Either you've got it with a field team, or you've had to work in the Emergency Operations Center, or you've had to work in the JIC, but you're very familiar with the ICS and what to do. And I had come back from one of my Ebola deployments, and I was told, well, it's a good thing you're back because there's a big pandemic flu exercise coming up. And I thought to myself, really? I've worked in the JIC, I've been deployed 2 or 3 times, I think I'm pretty familiar with what happens. And I was actually, in hindsight, I was really wrong to have that kind of attitude, because the pan flu, we need to do those exercises, we need to do those tabletops, and they help us be prepared. And even though I went in there grudgingly, I did need to go into it because we did have to exercise the pan flu scenario. And I did have communicators who hadn't deployed yet or hadn't gone through this scenario. And so it does work. And I went up to New York City. I was in Dallas for their Ebola, and I went to New York City. And New York City, their public health folks have the mindset that it's only a matter of time. We're going to see Ebola. We'll probably see the first case. Or if not, we don't see the first case, we will see it. And so they had just finished a tabletop exercise on the first Ebola case. And within days, they had their first Ebola case. So for them to transition to that contingency was quite easily done. And it was fantastic. So the best the best crisis management begins early on. And so at CDC, we're going to know that there are certain things that are going to precipitate a crisis or response for us. Let's say that we have a study with a new finding. Let's say we have a vaccine shortage. Let's say we have an infectious disease outbreak or a new disease. That's going to get us going into the crisis or rapid response mode. We also have to assess the potential risk. A long time ago at CDC, we'd have, when something was bubbling, we'd say something's bubbling, and you'd hear rumors that something's going on. And they would never put a communicator into this small circle of people. There'd be some key leaders, there might be the subject matter experts, but there wasn't a communicator. And then all of a sudden, one of these experts would come out and he would say, okay, we're doing a press conference tomorrow. And then we'd have to put together the press conference. And so that was very tough. And it didn't give us a chance to address the risk communication aspects of whatever we were announcing and to consider the media or our audiences. And now I think we're much better. We will put a risk communicator and a communicator into that small circle when it's bubbling, when you're actually talking about how we're going to announce this, what we're going to do, how we're going to deploy people. And finally, prepare and practice. And I talked about preparing and practice, and we can do this through tabletops and exercises, but we can also do this by getting our subject matter experts ready and by getting our communication folks ready to go. We've found that sometimes our bench is very, very short. The number of Ebola experts we had when Ebola started was just 2 or 3 Ebola experts from all CDC, so we quickly had to develop a much deeper bench. We can be prepared by being able to address certain things very quickly. We're going to have to talk about what's happened and what's going on, why, who is it affecting, how bad is it, are people like me or my family affected, how bad will things get, and what's being done to prevent more harm. And the 2 things in the middle are key to us. At CDC, we talk about, in communications, being first, being right, and being credible. And if we do that, we believe that people are going to come to us for that information. We're going to be trusted for that information. If we're open and transparent, and we're first, and we're right, and we're critical, then you'll come to us, and hopefully we'll be that trusted source for information. But we should be able to forecast in advance what people are going to be asking us and what people are going to be wanting to know right away. We want to have clear and responsive initial key messages. Very early on, what we put out is Zika is not a new virus. It goes back to the 1940s. But what we are seeing in the Americas is new. The Zika virus is a disease spread to people primarily through the bite of an infected Aedes aegypti mosquito. It's not currently found in the continental, Zika is not currently found in the continental US. The mosquitoes that can carry Zika are found in parts of the US. And women who are affected with Zika virus, either with or without symptoms, could have a baby with birth defects. And that's what we knew early on, and that's what we put out. For CDC, we found that our websites are critical before and during an infectious disease outbreak. We'll start out an outbreak after we do an activation, and we'll find tremendous requests for information from multiple audiences, from our partners, from policymakers and their staffs, from the media, of course, and from healthcare providers. All kinds of groups want information. And what we found that as much as we can put, we need to put it on the web. And it will still be overwhelmed, but we can also help people quite a bit by putting a great deal on the web. And here you can see some of the information we put up with Zika right away. What's new? And then we targeted specific groups. For Zika, particular groups that we were worried about, of course, were pregnant women, healthcare providers, travelers, mosquito professionals, mosquito control professionals, state public health laboratories, and public health partners. And we also put up our communication resources and our scientific resources. And I don't know if you noticed, but last Friday, we put out an MMWR. And we put out an MMWR every week, but what we've been seeing is we've been learning so much about Zika so fast, a lot of the MMWRs have been on Zika. And last Fridays, we did a telebriefing and we put out an MMWR that talked about what we learned, new learnings or new findings about Zika, how long the virus persists in semen, more guidance about women who are pregnant and what they should, more recommendations and guidance about getting pregnant or being pregnant with Zika. And that all came out on Friday, and we released it with an MMWR and a telebriefing. And this takes us to the CDC newsroom. We are doing a lot of telebriefings on Zika. I mean, there's almost one every week. We do telebriefings on other topics, but Zika has been weekly. And normally we could do full press conferences, but what we found is that it's hard for reporters to come to, if they come to CDC Atlanta, you have to go through security, your car is inspected. It's much quicker just to do a telebriefing and let the reporters dial in. So we've been doing quite a few of those. We do put the transcripts up on the website, and there are digital press kits up there as well. All right. So, my second communication principle is risk communication principles provide a strong and needed foundation. There were lessons learned from Ebola. You guys probably know these as well as I do. Any big organization after a contingency or an operation does a after-action review. And we did one for Ebola and one for risk communication. And we learned that we didn't acknowledge uncertainty as well as we should have. We were overconfident, or we made overconfident statements, and we failed to foreshadow changes. So risk communication is hard enough. And the challenge with Zika, and I would say almost every other new emerging infectious disease like Ebola or dengue, is that there is a lot that is uncertain. And we have to explain what is uncertain and what we're doing to find out. It's better, in the old days, we would have said, I think a few years back at CDC, our experts would have said, we're not going to talk about this, we don't know, we don't have the data yet, and so we wouldn't have said anything, but now we're convincing them that we have to explain what we know, what we don't know, and what we're doing to find out. It's better to be open and transparent about the process. What we put out are some key risk communication concepts we've learned is trying to be aware of the holy grail, and this Peter Salmon, I credit him with this, and that is believing that I can inform you, I can educate you, and I can motivate you without scaring anybody. Which is that we have to communicate uncertainty. I have to strive to create the same level of certainty in my audience as the information source. That is, not overstating or understating what is known and unknown. Anticipatory guidance. I have to foreshadow that recommendations will likely change as new information emerges. I will reduce audience perception of future changes as evidence of prior mistakes. In Ebola, when we changed the guidance for PPE, the questions came in, wait a minute, was PPE wasn't working before? We were not safe before? Why are you changing it? Is there something new you learned? We have to let you know that as we learn more, the guidance and the recommendations may change. Adjustment reaction period, the OMG period. We found that there's a phase of learning about a new risk, and a new risk can cause a temporary overreaction, but it also creates an opportunity for us to teachable moments. And that's when maybe I can affect behavior. Maybe I can impart lessons about how to mitigate this risk or how you can prevent this disease, because that's when you really want to learn that. Some key points we put out. We talk about anticipating that exotic and unfamiliar threats often bring or foster seemingly disproportional amount of interest, attention, and concern, even if it's a very small actual threat. And think about Ebola and the threat that Ebola was, say, to Houston. the threat was very little, but and here's what the CDC scientists said. This is not going to be a problem. People don't have to worry about this in America. Well, what we failed to do is that people are going to worry about this in America. It's an exotic, it's an unfamiliar threat, and even if the threat is very low, people are still going to react and pay attention. So we probably dismiss that too easily. Be very careful about assurances and offering reassurance and guarantees. And express and often lead with empathy and caring. I'll show you some examples of that in a second. Acknowledge early on that the possibility of rapid change, differences in actions, as well as expert opinions, and the likelihood that things arising aren't easily foreseen. All right. Let's talk a little bit about ineffective and effective risk communication. So, overconfident and overly certain Ebola-related statements. We said Ebola is highly unlikely in the U.S. We said the U.S. will stop Ebola. We have no doubt we can contain it. And we said any hospital that can isolate a patient can care for an Ebola patient. And later on, it turned out, well, and in fairness to our SMEs, we had seen Ebola a lot going back to 1976 when it first appeared. And it usually appeared in a very remote area of Africa, and it was handled very well. We hadn't seen it in a built-up urban area like Lagos. We hadn't seen it in the U.S. And so our statements were overly confident. Now, we learned. With Zika, we wanted to be careful. We wanted to be non-alarmist and not overly certain because we're still learning about Zika. And we said for the average American who is not traveling, this is not something they need to worry about. For people who are pregnant and considering travel to affected areas, please take this seriously. That's what we said early on, and of course you see our guidance recommendeds have changed or evolved a little bit as we learned more. There will likely be more travel-related cases in the U.S. And conditions in the U.S. make it highly unlikely, but not impossible, that there will be a serious outbreak here. So we were much more careful with Zika. My third communication principle is be prepared for sustained ongoing response and recognize that outbreaks evolve. We'll start out every outbreak or contingency at a sprint. Every time we activate, we are sprinting. There is so much to do. You have to bring folks into the EOC. You have to deploy teams out. When Ebola started, Dr. Frieden was testifying at Congress, and he said, I will have 100 people in Africa before the week's end. That's really hard to do, by the way. I was one of those 100 people. And I found out on a Sunday that I was going to Africa. I didn't know where, and I was gone by a Wednesday or Thursday without a visa. And by the way, going to Nigeria without a visa is not a good idea. I had guys with automatic weapons guard me until the embassy came and retrieved me. So, but we got 100 people in Africa within a week for Ebola. But you have to think about these outbreaks. You start sprinting, but it's going to turn into a marathon, or at least you have to forecast that it will turn into a marathon. And what I say is, you're sprinting and you're doing a lot at the beginning, but you have to think long term, because you're going to have to staff that EOC sometimes for months, sometimes for years. You got to think budget, manning rosters, and you got to think about all these things, the continuity of operations and how you can sustain this. Leaders and subject matter experts should always assume, they should always, even though you're sprinting, they should think marathon at the beginning. That regardless of how well or how skilled your communicators are, I don't care how good they are, there's going to be the negative headlines. There's going to be critical stories. And these outbreaks bring outrage, and media covers outrage. So your communicators in this group will tell you that they've all had this experience where you see that really nasty headline, and I'll get the call. Dago, have you seen this headline? Can you fix that? And so the first question I ask this person is, have you read the story? And the person hasn't read the story. They're just going off the headline. And the headline is to draw you into the story. And we've got to get and gosh, don't even get me started on social media. I work with the smartest people in the world. Our scientists and our researchers are so brilliant, and they're the world's experts. But I'll give you an example. I had a call during H1N1 on the weekend. And the world's expert in influenza, this woman knows more than anybody else. And she was upset because of a blogger had written something about her. And it took me forever, but I found the blog. I looked at the metrics. There's maybe 16 people who read the blog. And so Dr. Cox wanted to respond to this blogger. And so I took all weekend to explain to her, one, even if you respond, there's no telling what he'll post. Two, you'll now make this blogger incredibly popular. You'll have the world's flu engaging with this blogger. So I spent the weekend trying to keep her off social media. They're incredibly smart, but they can be very thin-skinned, and they don't appreciate that haters are going to hate. And some of them you just have to keep off social media. There's going to be a lot of interest in timelines. At a federal level, we deal with the Freedom of Information Act. So in almost every time we have a contingency or outbreak, we're going to go through the whole FOIA process. And we know that all our materials is going to be pulled. We also know that we're going to testify sooner than later. And so we build timelines, and we build that timeline for two reasons. One, because we know we're going to be testifying, but two, after the media covers what's happening and the amount of cases and how many deaths there are, they're going to start looking for who's to blame, what did we do wrong? And those autopsy stories is also helpful to have that timeline. All right, we need to quickly provide basic information. And so we put out very quickly that Zika is primarily spread through the bite of an Aedes aegypti mosquito. Most people infected with the Zika virus won't even know they have the disease because they won't have symptoms. 4 out of 5 people will not have symptoms right now, that's what we know. For those who do have symptoms, they are mild, they last for several days to a week. We said there are 5 things, we said there are 5 things you really need to know about Zika. And that is primarily spread through the bite of an infected mosquito. The best way to prevent Zika is to prevent mosquito bites. Infection in Zika during pregnancy may be linked to birth defects. Pregnant women should delay travel to areas where Zika is spreading. And returning travelers infected with Zika can spread the virus through mosquito bites. All right. In the past, we had high levels of certainty. That was our excuse not to communicate. And now I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to manage that uncertainty. So we want to make a commitment to openness and transparency and tell you, we don't know this right now. We do know this. This is what we're uncertain of. We're still learning a lot about mosquitoes, about Zika, and not only the STD, but also the mothers with Zika and the microcephaly. I was in João Pessoa, Brazil, and we were doing a retrospective case control study. And the goal, and they just finished it up, was to find 117 mothers or babies. The mothers we wanted to find mothers who had Zika and babies with microcephaly. And the idea was to find 117 of those and then find 2 to 3 controls for every case. So roughly you would have between 400 or 500 people. You would draw blood from everybody, and then everybody would answer a questionnaire, and the questionnaire was to look for other risk factors. It dealt with the seafood, it dealt with the larvicide, all the other rumors that were going around. And we should have results, hopefully, since this was retrospective, you can do it very quickly. We should have results pretty soon. But we need to find out a lot more about Zika. We had done a study before that, and I don't know if you've heard about Guillain-Barré syndrome with the paralysis. So right before our study began, we had done a retrospective case control study for the Guillain-Barré, where they found 40 people with Guillain-Barré and 80 people without. And once again, you try to find the same demographic group, but hopefully we'll learn more about the Guillain-Barré as well. So, we want to anticipate where interest will likely be going. So at CDC, when we do an activation for something like this, we never do it alone. If this is in the US, we're working with our partners at the local, county, or state level. They're on the front lines, your local public health departments, your county health departments, they are the boots on the ground. And if they need help, or whatever help they need, if it's lab or epi, whatever they need, we're here to help them. If we're working internationally, we're invited by a Ministry of Health and maybe working with the Ministry of Health of that country. We may be working with an NGO or certainly working for the State Department. In all cases, we're normally working for our parent organization, which is SHS, and maybe some other federal agencies. It could be USDA, FDA, or so we're never in it alone. And so when you're going into something like this, when you're doing the communications, you should anticipate that the purpose and the goals of your communication before going into it. The philosophy you're going to use. Unfortunately, we've been on some of these where some people are using a very passive, or what we call response to query only approach, and other people are using a proactive approach. That doesn't work very long at all. So you want to be using the same philosophy. You want to anticipate that the news media interests and the potential stories are going to evolve, and they're going to change, and they're going to go from what's happening to who's to blame. You want to anticipate the likely questions from the media, from the policymakers, and the public, and this will be a big help. So, we saw the evolution of Zika-related media stories. So some examples include that scientists misread the threat of Zika. We saw global warming and climate change blamed for Zika. And then the one on the bottom talks about engineered mosquitoes or genetically modified mosquitoes. And there's I think the firm is Oxyfarm. It's in one of the states of Brazil, and they're releasing mosquitoes as we speak every day as a way of combating Aedes aegypti. And this state, actually, a lot of people attributed this to the Zika outbreak in Brazil, which was not the case, but this is some of the evolution of the story. I would add to this, and you guys probably know too, the Olympics. The Olympics is a huge part of the Zika story. Can Brazil do the Olympics? Are they going to be able to make it safe for the Olympics? Should Olympic athletes travel? Women who might be at childbearing age or trying to get pregnant. So the Olympics became a big part of the story. And when I was in Brazil, the Pope made statements about women in Zika-affected areas and whether they should use birth control or abortion. So even the Catholic Church has evolved in this, for this type of stories. Communication principle number 4, it's important to set and guide expectations. All right, what do we mean by that? So one of our earliest media briefings was backed by Dr. Ann Schuckett, who's a principal deputy director for Dr. Frieden. And she said, "We know many people are concerned or scared, and we want to answer your questions, but what we do know." She said, "I wish we knew more about Zika today. I wish we could do more about Zika today." She said that I understand this is a stressful situation for women and families, particularly for women who are pregnant. And what we're doing in our efforts is prioritizing all the work that we can do to protect pregnant women. And we did. We went to work very quickly on the tests for pregnant women. We said it's possible, even likely, that we will see limited Zika outbreaks in the U.S. in the upcoming months. And if you look at her initial remarks on Zika, you see some of the foreshadowing. You see some of the empathy that we probably could have done during Ebola. So, you know, we're not the smartest guys, but we do learn. We'll do the telebriefings, and I've talked about the web, but we'll also try to put things out on all our platforms. And Dr. Frieden, our director, has a very active, he tweets very active. And so this is on the day that he was in Puerto Rico, on 10 March. He went out to Puerto Rico where we have the Dengue branch. And by the way, we were very concerned about Puerto Rico. He said, insecticide testing, the CDC Dengue branch, one insecticide was ineffective, the other knocked down the mosquitoes. And the same day, he said, it's going to take a multiple assault on mosquitoes to have an impact on Zika. Stay updated by, and of course he flags our website, which we love. He also talks about the $1.8 billion of funding that the POTUS has asked for from Congress. And there was also a telebriefing on this with him and Dr. Fauci from NIH talking about the $1.8 billion and how badly we need this. And he finishes up with, still much unknown about Zika. Our goal is to protect as many pregnant women as possible. So, we're going to talk a little bit about setting and guiding expectations, and part of that is saying what we know and what we don't know. So let's start with what we know and what we don't know. What we know about Zika is pretty easy. We know that Zika can be spread from a mother to her fetus. We know that infection during pregnancy is linked to birth defects in babies. That Zika spread mostly by a bite of an infected Aedes aegypti mosquito, and so this is what we put out, what we know. But fortunately, we also put out what we don't know at the time. At that time, we didn't know if there was a safe time during your pregnancy to travel to an area with Zika. And if you do travel and are bitten, how likely you are to get Zika, and how likely it is that your baby will have birth defects. So part of this, in situations involving a heightened risk perception, certainly a Zika situation, we know that developing scientific certainty, in other words, we're learning as we go here, we must explain what is known and what is not known. And so we're doing that much more with Zika. There's a WHO doctor by the name of Dr. David Heyman, and during SARS was another emerging infectious disease that we were learning about as we were trying to fight the pandemic. And he described it as, I'm building the boat as we're trying to sail it. So here we are, we're trying to fight Zika or SARS, but we're also learning about it as we're trying to, and so it's very difficult. We also found an issue with trying to explain, sometimes we take for granted, and those of you who do public health are probably very familiar with the difference between an imported disease and locally transmitted disease. So we also realized that we had to explain this. And oftentimes we have to explain things to the media and help the media cover this story. We're finding in the media that there are less reporters who do what we call scientific or health reporting. That when something like a Zika or Ebola comes up, they take people off different beats and they say, congratulations, you're now the scientific writer. So we sometimes a good deal of our effort is educating reporters. This Friday, I think this Friday we're having a session for local and state governments at CDC. We're inviting in people at local and state governments to talk to experts, and we're having the days devoted to learning about Zika. My fifth principle, when it comes to public health, communication must also account for people's fears and misperceptions. So if you go back to Ebola, at the end of October in 2014, we had 4 cases of Ebola in the US. But we also had a large overreaction by the public, by the media, by politicians. There was a graph that showed US media, and it just went straight up at the end of October. The graph, the amount of coverage was straight up. But then after that first week in November, it just fell off a table. And if you think back, that's when the midterm elections were going on. And right after the midterms, the media coverage just fell off. Meanwhile, if you looked at deaths in West Africa, they continued to climb. And it was interesting because we saw Ebola politicized. The Republicans claimed that the POTUS was mismanaging it. CDC didn't know what we were doing. We had to have an Ebola czar. They wanted stricter quarantines. Some governors came up with their own quarantine systems. And then we saw, they wanted flights to West Africa stopped. And then the Democrats, they said the Republican cuts to public health were a huge problem with Ebola. They said that the Republicans had cut funds so we couldn't do vaccine research. So we saw that issue politicized, and we saw the coverage just go up and then fall right off. And so we have to account for people's fears and misperceptions. I think you probably remember the stigma that was attached to the people who were either working on Ebola who came back from Africa. At CDC, we found that some people would come back from West Africa and then they would get a call from the school that said, we would prefer if you homeschooled your kids for the next 21 days. And we saw a lot of stigma attached because there was such a fear. I think, I remember, you guys probably remember the cruise ship that had this person was on her 20th day of case contact tracing, the 20th day. We quit after 21 days. So she was quarantined to her room on the ship. The passengers were refused exit at Belize, and then before the ship could dock in Galveston, you had to have a helicopter retrieve the blood of this woman, test the blood in your LRN in Austin, and then we could disembark passengers. And so it was the fear was amazing. So we will have to keep that in mind. And I think a lot of us at CDC dismissed that fear or did not appreciate that fear with Ebola. Well, let's talk about why Zika is so scary. New risks freak us out more than we know, than a known risk. It's a new risk. It's a risk to babies and mothers. And before we started today, we were talking about, in my table, some of the images that we saw and how powerful those images are. There's no sense of control. There's uncertainty. There's images and videos of babies with microcephaly, and there's no vaccine or immunization. When I was in Brazil, on the team, we had pediatricians, of course, but there was also a couple of geneticists who specialize in pediatric development. And they may go their whole career and maybe see a few cases of microcephaly. And so we walked into this maternity clinic, and there were 3 women with babies, and 3 of the babies obviously had microcephaly. And I just saw the surprise on their face. And we were grading microcephaly from 1 to 4, with 4 being the most severe case. And 2 of those babies were obviously a 4. And the pediatricians did examine them later on, but it's just such a powerful when you see it. And for them, I just saw the surprise in their eyes when they saw 3 or 4 right there in the waiting room. So this is microcephaly. The baby in the bucket almost went viral. I understand it went viral, that image of the baby in the blue bucket. So we want to provide perspectives and avoid confusion. Provide perspective and avoid confusion. So we do that, again, by putting out information. In this case, we're putting out information on the clinical evaluation of the disease, diagnostic testing, the sexual transmission. This was something that we had not seen with this family of viruses. And this family of viruses, chikungunya, and we had seen chikungunya for a while in the US, and you'll probably recall that not long ago we started checking the blood system for the donated blood for chikungunya, so we weren't unfamiliar with that. Dengue we'd seen for a while. In Brownsville, you'd had outbreaks in Brownsville. In South Florida, we'd seen outbreaks of dengue. Hawaii right now is in a state of public health emergency for dengue. I was in Hawaii in December, and that time we were up to about 250 cases of dengue. So this family of viruses is not new to us, but that STD case in Dallas, I have to admit, that surprised the Zika experts. They had not seen that with this family, this virus. When you talk about providing a sense of perspective, rumors and misinformation. The rumors we heard, and this is not new for Zika or Ebola. I was on Katrina, and Katrina, there was a rumor out that a rescue dog had jumped from a ship into the water, the floodwaters. And that time they were calling the water toxic gumbo. And so we were getting calls from not only from reporters, but policymakers saying, is this true? Do you know anything about this dog? And what's in the water? What killed this dog? And so we assigned an epidemiologist to find out if there was truth to this. And it spent 2 days, but we never could find the dog that died or any evidence of a dog dying. But we also started what we call rumor busters. Somebody on the team became a rumor buster to handle the latest rumors. The rumors we heard about Zika are that vaccines are to blame. And I remember I work in the vaccine center, so my folks were very angry about this. We heard that Tdap vaccine was a problem. We heard that there was an expired or bad lot of MMR vaccine. We heard HPV vaccine was the issue. There was a larvicide that was blamed for Zika. And one of the states in Brazil banned the use of this larvicide, which is probably helping certainly more than it hurt. We also heard about the genetically modified mosquitoes as a problem. We had heard gold dust was an issue. And then the facts are that the mosquitoes have been in Brazil for centuries, the Aedes aegypti. And they've been spreading dengue in Brazil for centuries. Well, not for centuries, but for some time. Zika is new to the country, and it was believed to arrive in 2014. In 2014, there was a paddling competition in Brazil, and many of the competitors came from areas where the Zika is endemic. So it's likely, what we believe is it came in 2014 with some of those competitors, that the Aedes aegypti bit somebody who was infected, and now you had an imported case, and now you have local transmission. There has been a rise in cases of microcephaly, a condition in which the brain stops growing mid-pregnancy. Those are the facts. In my last principle, we talk about providing perspective and addressing sources of potential or actual confusion. Here's Zika by the numbers. 3 million babies are born in Brazil each year. About 150 cases of microcephaly. That's what we see typically in Brazil. Now we're investigating 4,000 cases. 150 cases to 4,000 sounds like a huge jump, but when you do the math, and our guys always do, we see a risk rate of 0.0013. And then further, there's a Nature study that says that only 270 of these 4,000 cases may be confirmed. We do know that the WHO has declared a public health emergency of international concern. And they've only done that 3 times. Once for Ebola, once for polio in Central Asia, and now for Zika. We do know that the CDC is activated to level 1, which is a big deal for us. And we know that the POTUS has asked for $1.8 billion in emergency funding to enhance our ongoing efforts. Those are the numbers. Zika virus is in 39 countries right now where there's active Zika virus transmission. And if you've watched today's news, that you know that we're very worried about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is, I think we're up to 350 cases, and I think maybe up to 40 women we're tracking right now. We have to be able to distinguish Zika from Dengue and Chikungunya. And it's very confusing because in Brazil, we were worried because it's the same mosquito, and we know that dengue is already spreading in Brazil. So we have to help people understand the difference and what they might have. Dengue and Chikungunya virus is transmitted by the same mosquito in a similar ecology. It's dengue and chikungunya can circulate in the same area and rarely cause co-infections. Diseases have similar clinical features. So we had to help people understand if they were sick with chikungunya, dengue, or Zika, or they might not know. And I mentioned Brazil right now being at a state of emergency, a public health emergency for dengue. But we've already seen one, I think there's probably more than one imported Zika case as well. But it's the same mosquito. And then my final insight is always be ready for anything. I've done this quite a bit. And then when Dallas had their first Ebola case, it was a Tuesday. We were testing on a Tuesday. And I was on leave that day. And I got a call at 12 that said, you need to pack and get ready to go to Dallas. And then at 3 o'clock, I was told, go ahead and go to the airport. When you get to the airport, we'll tell you what flight you're on. So I packed up and I went to the airport. And I literally got to the airport. I grabbed my tickets and I was waiting to get on a flight, and I caught a call from a Dallas TV station. And I thought, not only did they know that I was on the team, they knew the flight I was on, and they had my cell phone number. And they said, can we do an interview with you? And I thought, yeah, good luck finding me at the Dallas airport. And I said, sure, I'll be happy to talk to you. Well, they found me. They had baggage claims staked out. So be ready for anything would be my last goal. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
I'd ask that, first of all, I encourage you to ask questions, but also identify yourself, because as you saw, David really did try to straddle 2 fences here. One was for the health communicators in the room who were very excited that he was coming to give this talk, but we also have some community members who are just more interested in Zika and learning more about that. So please identify yourself so that he knows exactly how to answer your questions. Anyone?
Yes, ma'am.
So I work with Kelsey Siegel Clinic. I'm the manager of media relations there. Some of our doctors have actually done interviews about Zika virus here in Houston. And I'm curious to know, how is the CDC tracking down the false claims and then kind of backing in and asking for are you asking for retractions or corrections or interviews, follow-up interviews to correct those
that's
mistakes?
a great question. And because you hear a lot of crazy rumors. The question is, are we tracking the rumors and sometimes the misinformation? And what do we do about it? And we do. We are actually tracking. We have a group inside our Joint Information Center that does media surveillance, social media surveillance. And so every day we do The day starts in the EOC about 05, and that's when they start assembling the briefing for our director. And at the first meeting is at 08, there's a meeting where you go over everything Zika related for the director. And one of those briefings is what's happening in the media and the social media world. And some of those, we'll look at some of those rumors. Some we will actively take on, and we'll tweet or we'll blog about it. Some we won't. Sometimes you give something legs that you don't want to give legs to. But I can tell you that, one, we do take a look at what's coming out, and two, we sometimes do address, not always. Sometimes it's just we look at the source or we look at the outlet and we'll say, we're not going to, or the other thing we can do too is we have partners. We can ask our partners to engage. It may be better for a partner to engage in the CDC, but we will address it, not all of them, but when we address it, it'll either be through our own social media channels or through our partners. And what we also found too is we're so overwhelmed, like an Ebola or a Zika, is a lot of times we work with our partners that if we can't do all the interview requests that we get, we'll put media onto our partners or other experts in the field to talk about it, because obviously it's hard to address all the different Zika media requirements. Yes, ma'am.
I'm aware of several Guillain-Barré cases in the area. There's been very little education about that aspect of it. Do you have any comments about that, or will there be something coming out?
Yeah.
You mentioned the study.
There is, and that's a great question. And we had a team, right before our team was in João Pessoa, Brazil, there was a team in Recife, Brazil, and they found 40 cases of Guillain-Barré, and they found 80 controls. And I think you may see something very quickly here. We're also worried about Guillain-Barré right now in Puerto Rico, and it's watching it very closely there. But that's the good news about a retrospective study, is that the findings, I would anticipate the findings sometime later in April or May, where we'll learn more about it. But I can tell you that's something we're very concerned about. And that was the first study we launched in Zika, was the Guillain-Barré study. And you probably saw it with West Nile as well, too. We saw West Nile with the Guillain-Barré.
One other part of the question is there a way a person can be tested for this?
For Guillain-Barré?
For not
Well, you can be tested.
Guillain-Barré, but I mean for the cause.
Yeah.
Guillain-Barré seems to be a bucket of
You can be
causes.
You can be tested for Zika, yes, ma'am, or dengue, or any of these. Yes, ma'am.
Well, to follow up on that point, do you put that on your website, that these are action steps that citizens can take? You can be tested if you think you have it.
Yeah.
You know, certain, maybe you should wear DEET, or, you know, things.
That's a great question, yeah.
Action steps that ordinary people can take to help prevent it?
Yeah, and if you go to our website, you'll see that the best way to prevent Zika and dengue and other diseases that are mosquito-borne is not to get bit. We call it fight the bite, if you will. We encourage DEET. If you don't like DEET, there are other things you can wear without DEET that will protect you. We'll tell people, you know, the Aedes aegypti is a day biter, but there are other mosquitoes that bite primarily at dusk and dawn. But so you want to protect yourself with the Aedes aegypti. It's also a very lazy mosquito. It's not going to travel very far. Unfortunately, it's very comfortable in your home. And the experts or the entomologists will tell you it only needs a cap full of water to breathe. So it's very difficult to fight. So you want to protect yourself. I was in Hawaii in December, and I can tell you, even in December, when it's really nice in Hawaii, we were wearing long pants and long sleeves and doing DEET. And we looked a little strange. Everybody else is short pants and Hawaiian shirts, but I was really worried, not so much about Zika then. I was really worried about dengue, because there are 4 strains of dengue, and dengue's nickname is breakbone fever, and you really don't want to get anything that's nicknamed breakbone fever. So I was really worried about that. But you should go to our website. I think you'll see lots of different ways to protect yourself and what we recommend. Yes, sir.
I work for the Student Health Center, and I'm kind of curious because clinicians and epidemiologists are pretty siloed in their discipline. I mean, clinicians obviously working directly one-on-one with the patient. Epidemiologists just describe disease. However, the way they describe disease may not be in a way that actually prompts public behavior change or public interest.
Right.
So I'm wondering how much effort goes into taking the information you hear from a clinician and trying to repackage that in a way that the public would actually be receptive to.
So, and this is a great question, because a lot of what we do is translating the science into messages the community can use or the public can use. And our scientists, our scientists hand me something that, you know, we need to get this out, and I'll look at it and I can't understand it. It's written in, it would be great for a JAMA article or Lancet, but this is something I'm trying to make the community understand. And so then they go, you're dumbing it down. No, I'm not dumbing it down. I'm considering my audience. So you're right, it is a skill because you have to take work from scientists and researchers and make it ready for multiple audiences, whether the audience is the public, the media, or policymakers. So a lot of what we do is trying to help them craft messages that people will understand. And when we talk about the uncertainty in communications, one of the folks that make it so difficult are my darn scientists. Well, by the way, I love them to death, but they hate to admit that they're uncertain on anything. They're the experts. Let's say you've been studying Zika your whole career and you're recognized as a Zika expert, and I'll ask you a question about something. They don't want to admit that they're uncertain because they're a recognized expert, and you have to force it out of them. We really don't know this right now, do we? Well, we're going to find it out, and blah, blah, blah. We really shouldn't say anything right now until we know. No, and this is where you get into the battle. We need to say that we don't know, and we need to say what we're going to do to learn it. But for them, it's hard to admit, or they're frustrated because they don't know. But we have to communicate that. And translating it from science to the general public and that's where we need the communicators to help us do that. But that is an issue. Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered about the area you mentioned where Zika is endemic. And is there a similar frequency of these cases of microcephaly there, or does it differ?
You know, and that's such a great question. Let's say that if Zika's been around since the 1940s, and there's been, let's say, like the Philippines, where it's been endemic for a long time, why haven't we seen more microcephaly? If it's been in Uganda since the 1940s, where it was discovered in the Zika forest, shouldn't we be seeing microcephaly? We should, and you would think we would. I mean, did microcephaly just start in Brazil from Zika? And part of this, we don't know yet. Honestly, we may do more studies, we may find out, but honestly, it may have been microcephaly that we didn't have the medical surveillance to find out if we indeed were seeing a rise in microcephaly. And we certainly never attributed it to Zika before, until Brazil. Then we thought there might be a connection. And hopefully, they're doing our retrospective case study, and there are other case studies going on. We hope to learn a lot more about how Zika may have caused or may play a factor in the microcephaly we're seeing. But that's a great question, and I wish we had a better answer for you. But you would think that we would have seen it in those endemic countries, and it wouldn't be a surprise to us. Yes, sir.
Given the political turmoil in Brazil, who's got the ball there in trying to handle?
That's a great question, and there has been some political turmoil in Brazil. The president recently appointed the ex-president as her chief of staff so he could avoid, and then there's calls for impeachment. The Ministry of Health has got the ball, and I can tell you that when we were doing our study, our team was, we were 43 people strong, and most of the people were from the Ministry of Health or from, and I don't know if you've ever heard the term disease detectives. At CDC, we have a 2-year program where you spend 2 years as a disease detective and you learn your craft and you investigate. Well, Brazil has the disease detectives too, and they were participating. So the team I was on, we had roughly 20-something folks from either the Ministry of Health or Brazilian disease detectives working with CDC. So in spite of the turmoil, the work was going on, and there are a lot of studies, and they're also working with WHO because we have to get to, and by the way, there's a great deal of interest to getting up to the bottom of this with the Olympics coming up soon. So the work was going on, it was going through the Ministry of Health primarily. Yes, ma'am.
You said that and it's known that a little bit of water can cause a lot of damage. Is there any educational thing for the general public regarding water and a fumigation project?
I'm not so sure about fumigation. That we may want to talk like one of the professionals. But I know that when we were working in Hawaii in dengue, the Hawaiians were so concerned about it, they formed these SWAT teams that would go to properties that were either not inhabited or abandoned, and they would literally go in there and they would pull the tires out. They would dump all the standing water out. It doesn't take much water for this particular mosquito to breed. And we found too that some people were using, there was the idea that somehow dishwashing detergent, if you drop that into water, you could prevent the mosquito from breeding. But our entomologists could not find any data to support that. So we were able to switch them from using this dishwashing, because the thought was that the detergent somehow prevented the mosquito from landing on the water. But we were much more happy if they used a larvicide. But there is information about what you can do to make if you want to do it, you should make your house safe. You should do a walk around and look, and there's information about what you need to eliminate as far as standing waters or what areas mosquitoes prefer to breed in and how you can make it safe. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of mosquitoes, how effective do you think the release of these genetically engineered mosquitoes will be?
You know, that's fascinating. I heard it. Did you hear the NPR piece this week on it?
Not this
There was a really good one. I think there's, the FDA I know is looking at it, and it has not been licensed yet by the FDA, but there are several countries who are trying it. So I'm hoping that we may see something very soon. It sounds like it will work, but I don't think there's any data yet And because we're a little ways away for a vaccine. We really need a vaccine. And unfortunately, I think we're probably a year or maybe longer away from a vaccine for Zika.
David, can you just, for those in the room who have not heard about that, can you just give a brief summary of what you're talking about?
So, yeah, they basically release male mosquitoes. And the male mosquitoes are genetically modified or engineered, so they not only can they not produce, cannot impregnate women. If they do impregnate women in some way, then all the offspring die. So the female mosquito is the one that bites you. She needs a blood meal. So she gets her blood meal, but she mates with this male mosquito that can't impregnate her. So even if she gets her blood meal, there's not going to be any new mosquitoes behind. That's the theory. And there's Oxyform, I think, is the company that's doing it in Brazil right now. There are several other companies exploring it as well. But we watched, I mean, mosquitoes are difficult. I mean, if you think back to the early 90s when West Nile got started in New York City, it went all the way across the continental United States. And so West Nile now is endemic here. So the mosquitoes it's not going to be an easy fight. I mean, you know, think about right now we're watching yellow fever in Angola. That's quite scary. And so it's a constant battle. And you know, some people will talk about DDT and the loss of DDT, and is that a factor? I'm not sure, but I do know that we have to protect ourselves. Certainly, and where you guys are in Houston and us in Atlanta, mosquitoes are going to become a very big part of our life. They haven't already because the weather is getting warmer and warmer. And what we're seeing in Puerto Rico, we'll see as it continues to warm. We see more mosquito activity, and unfortunately, we may see more Zika. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just a citizen here, but if I know you were asking Congress, or they had a bill before Congress to ask for 1.8, is it billion?
Yes, ma'am.
1.8 billion?
Billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are they going to use that for?
That's a great question. Well, we'll waste a good part of that because we are the federal government. No. To put that in perspective, our annual budget at CDC is about $12 billion. But you recall that the best federal agency is CDC, so you don't mind us getting $12 billion. But we do need $1.8 billion, or the POTUS has asked for $1.8 billion for Zika. And a lot of this is for the research on the vaccine. It's for the work like on the mosquitoes. We're really worried about Puerto Rico. There's a lot of cash, a lot of money will have to go to Puerto Rico, because right now we're seeing the beginning of an explosion there. I hope that's not the case, but potentially it could be very bad there. Yes, ma'am.
Are they thinking about any kind of spray or anything?
We're looking at different ways. Spraying is not obviously the most effective. Different mosquitoes behave differently. The Aedes aegypti will not travel very far, and will probably stay. It's very happy to be in your house, unfortunately. And some mosquitoes are not. Other Culex mosquitoes are happy, and you can spray and you can get them because they want to be outside. But spraying for this particular mosquito, like truck spraying, it may not, if it's inside your house already, it may be a problem and it may not get that mosquito. So there are certain situations where spraying makes a lot of sense depending on what mosquito you're going after and the time of year and what it's doing. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a two-part question. The first part is Harvard School of Public Health released that study today about the CDC Zika messaging and how there's still a lot of confusion based on the messaging. So one, what are you guys doing to try to tweak that message? And the other question that I have is that understanding that historically a lot of cultures have ill perceptions with government, and you guys are trying to balance some of the messaging that has to do with the falsehoods with how Zika is. How do you guys balancing between getting those messages out to communities, understanding that government is not probably the best place to get that information?
So very good question. So are we messaging as well as we could? Probably not. We're probably going to learn things from our messaging on Zika. I can tell you there hasn't been an outbreak. I've gone on, for the CDC, I'm up to 23 different times I've gone to the field. Every time I go out, I learn something. I've learned something, and I will tell you that I'm not surprised if Harvard did a study and they found out that we could be messaging better. I'm sure we can. We have to message to a lot of different audiences, and we certainly know that not one message will meet every audience. So yeah, we could probably message better, and we're probably going to learn from Zika, and we learned from Ebola. And the second part of the question was, is it hard sometimes doing this if there is a distrust for people in the public health, and certainly in the federal government. And sometimes you'll see people at CDC in uniforms. And we have people who are in the public health service, and they're one of the 7 uniform services. And so when we deploy, oftentimes those guys won't wear their uniforms because in some people, the last thing they want to see is somebody walking up that looks like they're from DOT. And I was in an outbreak, kind of a response in southern Indiana, where we were trying to find, it was for abusing opiate drugs. So essentially, we were trying to find cases and contacts of people who were injecting illegally drugs. So imagine how hard it is. You're from the federal government and you're trying to find these people who are breaking the law. We couldn't find any of these folks. They didn't trust us at all. So what we ended up doing was finding folks who were part of that group, and going door to door with them with us, because that can be a problem if you're with the federal government. Certainly if you're in a uniform from the Public Health Service, there may be a distrust for you, and we have to understand that. And you're right, if you talk to our folks who do HIV, they've done a lot of groundwork into reaching all different kind of audiences in different situations, and understanding that you just can't walk up and say, hi, I'm with the federal government, and we're here to help. Yes, ma'am.
You said that you had to distinguish from Zika, Chikungunya, and Dengue. If, like in Puerto Rico, if they go for a test of Zika, can they distinguish from that test of Zika what they might have or what they might not have?
You know, it's quite difficult because it's the CDC has labs that can distinguish between whether the person has Zika, whether the person had dengue or chikungunya before that, or whether it's a co-infection with both. But it can be very difficult. The lab testing is improved. One of the things that one of the very first things we do for an Ebola or Zika is there are labs. It's called the Laboratory Response Network, and it's all over the country. There are labs, and we put out lab testing kits and help them develop tests so that more and more labs are able to test and be able to determine this. So I don't know exactly where we are, but I know that we can distinguish between dengue and Zika. I'm not sure about chikungunya, but we can check for you. But that's one of the things that we have to do very quickly when we have a new emerging infectious disease, is develop the lab test possible to distinguish the disease. Yes, ma'am.
And one other question I had was, has there been any information or news regarding, has it affected animals in any way, or the animals' offspring, or all I hear about is pregnant ladies?
Yeah, and this came up, do you remember in Ebola, one of the nurses had a dog that went to Texas A&M, and dogs can get Ebola, but we haven't, I'll be honest with you, I don't know of any work yet, certainly not at the CDC, because we've kind of prioritized this, and then the priority has been to pregnant women, obviously, and babies, but I don't know yet, and I'll have to check for you if Zika can go to animals and what it might do to animals. But that was the case with Ebola, though. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
There was an article today's Houston Chronicle about, they found a new mouse model for Zika, and they ended up using the chikungunya mice that they were using to test that. UTMB in Galveston apparently got that. Are you in touch with those people? And
yeah, in fact,
what's the significance of, what type of time frame are we talking about once you can infect a mouse or an animal to possibly determine if you can make a vaccine? So
that's a great question, and a lot of the UTMB guys are ex-CDC guys. There's about 2 or 3 guys who were at CDC and went out to UTMB. So there is a link to UTMB, but there's been some progress, I guess, in a mouse model. And so the next step will usually be an animal model, and then if that goes well, we'll go into clinical trials with people. And I was part of it. We were doing clinical trials in Sierra Leone for an Ebola vaccine, and that can move quickly. And I'm hoping that Zika will be on the fast track too, because a vaccine for Zika will be huge, and we really need it. So it's hard to put a time frame on it, but I can say from the mouse model, usually we'll go to another animal model, and then to clinical trials with people before it can go for FDA license. Here's a question. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us if there's any updates as far as Mexico is concerned, what's going on there, especially along the Texas border?
I don't know specifically today, but I can find out for you. I can give you my email. I'm happy to. By the way, if you guys want my email, you can email me, and if I don't have the answer today, I can find out for you. And my email address is D as in Delta, R as in Romeo, D as in Delta, and then the number 4, drd4@cdc.gov. And so if there's a question, and remember, I'm a communicator, not a scientist or a researcher, but I specifically Mexico, we may have maps up. I haven't checked our website, but and maybe I can find out for you. I'm happy to look it up. Yes, ma'am.
Well, there is a vaccine for Zika. Would it be best to recommend women in affected countries to hold off on becoming pregnant? And if so, is it within the power of the CDC to perhaps make contraceptives more available in those affected countries?
Oh, that's a really tough question. So early in this outbreak, the Colombian health minister gave the following advice: women should not get pregnant for 6 to 8 months. Now, the shock value of that is probably pretty amazing. It probably raised awareness of it. But is it really practical advice? I mean, is it doable? Can everybody just put off getting pregnant for 6 to 8 months? And we're talking about a Catholic country where birth control is not exactly a thing they do. So no, we don't think that's good advice. I mean, we can't get into the politics or the religious aspect, but we don't think that we can tell women not to get pregnant for 6 to 8 months. What we have to tell women is protect yourself and protect the developing baby. Protect yourself from Zika, and when you're carrying the baby, continue to protect yourself and the baby. But you're right. I remember seeing that advice: don't get pregnant to 6 or 8 months, and we're like, ooh, okay, that's gonna. I like to see them affect that behavior for 6 to 8 months. You know, basically don't have sex. So, yeah. So no, that's a good question, but I think it's hard to do. And then if you see the line the CDC will take, it's more about protecting the mother and not getting infected with Zika and not getting the baby infected. Yes, is there something I missed?
Yeah, we're talking about women and pregnant babies, but people can die from hemorrhagic dengue, so.
Yeah, there are 4 strains of dengue, and so unlike Zika, right now there's 1 strain, and you can get Zika, and most of us will not know it and will be immune from it. But unfortunately with dengue, you can get sick with 1 strain, and there's 3 other strains that you can still get sick with, and there is a hemorrhagic form of dengue. So I can tell you that when I was in Brazil, I was much more scared of dengue than I was of Zika, and one, because the moniker of break-bone fever, but also dengue is very scary. And dengue has been, and it's funny, we find ourselves in countries where maybe both are spreading, but people are more focused on Zika, when I find dengue very intimidating.
So actually you shouldn't get bitten by a mosquito.
I think that's the best advice to give you. If you're in an area and you know that it's an area that is endemic to Zika or dengue, I say you have to protect yourselves. And right now, if that area has Zika, and if with my daughter traveling there and she was married and thinking of a baby, I would ask her to postpone that trip because I would worry about her. And I think that's what we're telling women right now. I haven't looked at our latest guidance based on Friday, but I think our guidance is probably much more forceful about women who are pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant. Because the same thing with Ebola. We did not know that Ebola would last in semen as long as it lasted. That's something we found out from this outbreak, and we saw it right away. I think we're saying 2 months right now for the virus living in semen. But this is stuff that we're actually learning. It's developing data. Yes, sir.
My name is Jordan Land. I'm a studies coordinator here at San Diego State University. So I work with most of the students I work with are actually female students, and we do have several programs that are traveling to Central and South America this summer. So I guess my question is, I'm not so concerned about female students being pregnant on the trip. I've actually only seen that once in the time that I've been doing this. I would be mostly concerned with students who may return and import a case of Zika. How do we may not know this information, but let's say in the worst case a student becomes infected with Zika, about how long after the symptoms dissipate should they be concerned about not being pregnant or trying not to become pregnant?
Ooh, you might have to email me that one. I'm so sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. But I can tell you that the team I was on in Brazil, we sent 16 epidemiologists, 11 of them were young women of childbearing age. And what CDC did was their supervisor confirmed that you had no intention that you're not pregnant. We have tested women, and when they found out they were pregnant, we wouldn't send them out. And then we all made sure that they understood the risk, and they were going out there with it, knowing that they would not get pregnant, certainly, or become pregnant on the trip. It really was a concern for us, and we have a pretty aggressive occupational health clinic at CDC that's really good about screening people when they go out, and then when you come back. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned just quickly about being immune to it after you've gotten Zika, and you're immune to it later. But then if a mosquito bites you,
He won't be labeled Zika or the dengue or anything. No, so and dengue, the immunity is harder to get because there are 4 strains. So the best advice is to protect yourself and your family from getting bitten, and that either use the DEET or wear the long sleeves, but don't get bitten. Certainly not right now when we're worried about some of these things, because you don't know. Yes, ma'am.
When you talked about 2 months of the disease staying in the semen, were you talking about the Ebola, or were you talking about the Zika?
Zika right now, I think last Friday's MMWR talked about 2 months. I think we've seen longer with Ebola, which is all new for us. I think it actually could be up to 90 days or more with Ebola. And then we saw things with Ebola that we hadn't seen before, because typically the Ebola outbreaks, Ebola is a stupid virus. it dies out very quickly. It kills everything. So we never saw I don't know if you remember the nurse who had the eye problems, or months afterward the Ebola appeared in the eye. This was amazing. I mean, this is stuff that we hadn't been able to study before and had no data on. So I think Friday's MMWR talked about the Zika virus and how long it would stay in semen, and it gave out new guidelines about pregnancy and when you're pregnant and what you should do. So that is all online, and you can, CDC publishes it on our MMWR, so it's available.
Thank you.
I was actually, this is a statement kind of leading into a question, but I was in Brazil, in rural Brazil in 2014, and I was in a town called Araraquara. I spent about a week there, and dengue was very, very prevalent, and the local community was very concerned about it. And one of the things I've been reading recently is that some governments in Central and South America may be redirecting resources away from dengue to combat Zika, when as you mentioned, dengue may in fact be more alarming. Is that something that you've seen? Can you corroborate that?
Yeah, I can tell you that we were thinking, some of our entomologists were thinking that we're seeing the Zika right now in Brazil, but thought we would still see the dengue, because we know dengue is there, and we'd seen dengue previously. So the thinking is that maybe there's a lot of attention to Zika, but it's the same mosquito that transmits dengue as well. So we don't think you sometimes worry that we're paying it way, and don't get me wrong, I mean, when you look at the images of the babies and the mothers, that you can't help but not take Zika very serious, but is dengue really a bigger threat? And for some folks it is. But I would say, yeah, the dengue is still there in Brazil, and we think we're going to see a lot of dengue cases later this year. So I don't know how to tell you which one, and resources, with the oil being cost down, that has really hit Brazil hard. And so things are very difficult there, and I imagine the resources are very scant right now. So I don't know about if they've been shifting away from Zika and dengue, and by the way, they probably don't have enough resources for just one of those. So I imagine it's got to be a real problem. Yes, sir?
Yeah, can I just make a comment about that? If there's any kind of silver lining to that, it's the fact that Zika and dengue and chikungunya are carried by the same vector. So if you have the proper surveillance and control strategies, then it really doesn't make a difference because it's carried by the same vector.
One more question?
I kind of wanted to know, the women that you visited in Brazil, the ones that have the microcephaly, or the ones that come in thinking that they have the Zika virus and they're already pregnant and they haven't given birth yet, is there a way to first tell them that they do have one of those three from some test? And then the second thing is, how can you help them during the pregnancy and can we determine that there is going to be a birth defect before the baby comes?
So the mothers of the babies with microcephaly, I can tell you that was very difficult. I mean, after I went to one maternity clinic, I did not want to go to another one. But one thing I saw with the mothers, and especially these children, and these children are not going to develop, and was when you went to their homes, you saw that it was neighbors, it was extended family, they were all pitching in. And there's not a very good healthcare system in that area. Where João Pessoa is a very poor area of Brazil. And there's not a very good healthcare system. And one thing we worried about is down the road, what will the burden be on a healthcare system that's not already strong when you start seeing these babies affected with microcephaly, and will they need more care? But I was really impressed with the families and neighbors who became part of that family just to help out with that baby with microcephaly. The women who participated in the test, and let's say, and we didn't take any, there's another test that's doing women who are pregnant now. Ours was retrospective, you already had a baby. So we can tell from the blood. We'll learn from the blood, did the mother have Zika? How did the mother move the Zika to the fetus? And we'll learn a lot about that retrospectively. Prospectively, I think, and I don't know, I'd have to check this for you, we can test a woman and see if she had Zika. And I don't know how much we know yet about how that Zika will affect the fetus before the birth. But this is a very dynamic time. A lot of the stuff, we use the analogy of building the ship as we're sailing it. And essentially that's what we do with a lot of the infectious diseases. They come so quickly and there's so much to learn.